And which camera do you want? Do you want it on you or do you want it for the room?
This one. Yeah.
Here,
I
so,
want to be the star of the show.
okay,
You
here,
want to be
wait,
the
so,
star.
here, wait.
Andy's gonna sing and dance also.
Well, Mike and I are gonna sing you in Polish.
And then I want to give you
Happy
something.
birthday.
Thank you.
So here, look, so, or it's that one, so you can turn around.
What? Yes, I'm doing this. Vitalife. I'm doing the Vitalife.
People go maskless here.
You can if you're up here, yes.
So I would say,
If you're gonna do this one, I'm turning this off because, there you go.
yeah, I'd say
It's, keep it that way?
let's keep this.
Okay, so
I like
now. This. Okay, Gmail.
And this is the mic we're using.
Oh, come on.
Mike, was that inspiration for your talk today?
Yeah.
I'm sick of Scott coming to me directly. Let's just
Let's just
do this for everyone.
Scott specific topics here on out. Peloton condo rentals.
All right, tech guy,
What?
how do I share? Oh, there it is, share
There you
screen.
go. Speaking of, I'm gonna text Frank and see how the Veeds guy is.
Oh, yeah. He gave you the info on the fence, so we're just waiting on the village for that. The village is taking a long time on zoning, a couple months out still on that, but the fence should be wrapped up here by the end of this month. They're just horribly good.
Okay,
Oh,
so here's,
Beverages for the thing?
Beverages over there?
I dropped off some beverages
Oh,
for that,
they're all gone.
you took back. No, Frank
So
was
your
asking-
screen sharing is here. I don't know if this will work, you might have to.
maybe we download it?
Oh, you gotta hit play. You're gonna hit present on that, and then you can use the clicker.
How about we do, cause it's just from, so maybe we just download it?
Scott's our tech guy.
Cause this is just from like this is from Box on my end. So it's not really like in a program that you can play it in. It just gives you like access to the file. So if I download it, then it'll be the PowerPoint document. Right now,
Yeah.
it's just.
What is the
You do.
tree?
You do.
Let me check the tree button for them.
And we got waters in that fridge.
Reported you.
All right.
That's all you get.
But I guess
Or-
No. Yeah, there you go. Now. Oh, that's right here.
Oh, no? Wow.
2 days? Monday,
Looks
Tuesday.
like you're just gonna have to scroll.
Yeah, that's
All right.
I should
Or the arrow.
I should compare this to like a 2016 one where it says like tenants can get out of the property within 30 days in order of possession. The sheriff will work right on it.
Uh-huh.
This should show you the 2016 timeline versus the 2021.
You just want this like right here so you can quickly, easily
Yeah.
just scroll. I don't think you need a keyboard. But there you go. Yeah. So Frank wants to obtain a commercial property where he can store and sell cars. Like up to maximum 10 cars. He's gonna do some online auto dealer thing. What are you getting into now, Scott?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, there's in Naperville, there's like garage suites. It's like, there's one that I always look at because I I'm kind of into like that kind of space, and there's one in Naperville that's selling for like $500,000. But you can store, I don't think you can do 10 cars, but you can do
I don't know if you know, but
6 to 8, I think. But then there's like cars, and it's like nice and open, and there's like a mezzanine up top, like food, drinks, TV, and stuff like that. And then there might be a lift in there too. Really nice. You should sell them. That's then we can go hang out.
Naperville, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to go that way, but.
Yeah. Well, it's like in a complex where there's a bunch of like industrial condos, and all of them are car related. There's like auto repair shops. There's like vintage restoration. There's like a waxing and cleaning place. So it's a good like location to be in because you can use all those services.
Right. He was saying just like right on Northwest Highway, something on this stretch, there's like a handful of places that you can have cars in, cars out in the front,
Yeah.
a little window.
What about
He also just wants like one address that's not his personal property to funnel all his business addresses to.
yeah, just good call. I can probably get started.
They're spoiling us, Mike. Drinks, music,
Oh, that's right.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
hopefully,
thank you.
hopefully it was fun.
Yeah, it was the first time I sat down and listened to music probably in a year.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're great. They're a fun band.
And I like that you'll sue anybody.
That's right.
Right, I had no idea. You have to let us know those things.
I had to cut one thing out that was a little bit off color that they were. I cut it out of their performance.
Oh.
It got too aggressive. Sure.
Just won't work.
Check one. Hey guys, good to see you. How are you?
Yeah, you know, I would,
Because I'm gonna be running out. You can have another appointment. I'm gonna be running out, so enjoy and then. And that Saturday, the open house is 12. That's the Saturday, the 13th.
There's one avenue that's sexy. No, but with the moratorium extended.
Yeah.
She's showing signs, you know.
Is there anybody on the Zoom, Mike?
That I'm not sure.
Julie's on it.
They're waiting for their sandwich deliveries.
Yeah. Should have run into them off.
I'm gonna check and see.
Yeah, no, they'd show up there.
They show up there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll get started.
What is new stuff with this?
Morning, everyone. My name is Mike Mazek. I'm a real estate attorney. I've worked with some of you. I know just about everybody in here. For those of you who don't know, I do real estate transactions and litigation. So we do quite a bit of transactional work these days. Things are really busy. When that happens, there's a lot of conflict. And so our firm handles, for other attorneys as well as for our own clients, litigation related to purchasing and selling property. We also represent people in estate planning, probate, and one of the other areas we represent people is landlord tenant law. So landlord tenant law, unfortunately, the conversations that tend to happen when clients call me, usually landlords, they'll say, hey, I have someone to evict. I say, great, watch the news, and when the moratorium is lifted, we'll touch base then. Right now, there's a current statewide moratorium on evictions in the state of Illinois. There's also a federal moratorium on evictions. We'll talk a little bit about the distinction between those two. But all of this is based on the current moratorium on evictions, which is extended until March 6th. So that is fully expected to be extended again. So most likely we're going to be into May or June. I was on a call with some of the judges at the Daily Center where they were giving a little bit of a clue as to how they're going to treat evictions later this year. And the goal is each month to open up the window a little bit for more and more evictions. not for all of them to come at once. So right now, there's about 30 to 40,000 evictions that are waiting to be filed. And those evictions cannot be filed. There are certain situations where they can be filed. So we can talk about that, but in those situations where there is an eviction, we may have the possibility. And we're going to speak about this perhaps a little bit more from the landlord's perspective, because from a tenant's perspective, it's pretty straightforward. There's no evictions unless you're not a covered person. Covered people under the moratorium, we're going to talk about here in a minute. So, by the way, just as background, it's pretty important to know a little bit about this because you'll probably have clients that will ask you questions about this. You're going to have clients who are either landlords or tenants, and it's good to have a little bit of background as to what's going on. You don't have to give them legal advice, obviously. You can relay them to me or whoever you work with on a regular basis, but you can, by providing this kind of information, you're providing value for your clients and they'll be more likely to reach out to you. So for instance, staying on top of the moratorium deadline, that's a great opportunity to send out perhaps an e-newsletter saying the moratorium deadline has been extended. These are the reasons why and these are the terms. So right now, the current moratorium sort of started on January 9th. That's when the last year's moratorium was adjusted to allow for a few more evictions. If anybody remembers, back in 2008 to 2011, the foreclosure crisis was very similar to this. And it was sort of looking like, and I practiced in those days, I'd go into the courtroom, there'd be 150 people in every courtroom, and you'd show up to the Daily Center and everybody was just getting slowly foreclosed, one after another. And the Daily Center is not prepared for that. So they don't want that to happen. So the goal is to allow for an opening, a smaller opening, so more and more evictions take place so that it doesn't all just happen on one day. The Daily Center is terrified of all the landlords lining up one day to file all their evictions. It's a bad look too. It doesn't really look good for the state to have a bunch of people wind up homeless. That's not the goal. So right now, if you have a landlord in this situation, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the options. But this current one was extended to February 6th and then now to March 6th. So the way it looks is that there's a 4-part test to determine whether you're a covered person. If you're a covered person under the moratorium, that means you cannot be evicted. You can send a 5-day notice, you can send a 10-day notice, but that tenant cannot be evicted. You can't file the eviction yet.
You can't file the eviction, you said?
Correct.
I thought you could file, but you couldn't have them physically removed.
So if they're not, so this is the covered person. So this is under this scenario we're gonna see, it's for people who cannot pay rent due to a COVID-related hardship. But let's say they breach the lease, right? What if the lease ends, they're paying rent, they've paid every month, and then the lease ends, and that the first day beyond the lease term, they're there. And you sent a notice to terminate tenancy. In that scenario, they're not a covered person because their hardship is not COVID related. For that, you can file an eviction.
So what did she say? Well, I got COVID.
If the tenant got COVID, that probably doesn't qualify as a covered person. If the tenant got COVID and then couldn't work for a week and then work later off or put her on a different schedule, or I'm going to show you what the document looks like. It's very easy for a tenant to claim a COVID-related hardship. I mean, it's really easy. You can put just about anything in, and you can say that it's a COVID-related hardship. So, and then it's not like the burden then shifts to the landlord to say, well, it's not. The courts just agree that if the tenant under perjury has said that they have a COVID-related hardship, there's no evidentiary hearing, there's nothing else that happens. So the case can't move forward. The 4-part test is the person has to, they can't earn more than $99,000 a year individually or $198,000 if they're filing a joint return. So if they make more than that, they're not a covered person. Then there's some other items here as it relates to tax returns. Those are not as common. The second part is that they're unable to make a full rent or housing payment due to a COVID-related hardship, including but not limited to substantial loss of income, loss of compensable hours of work or wages, or an increase of out-of-pocket expenses directly related to the pandemic. The third part of the test is the individual is using their best efforts to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment as the individual. So, this language of the best efforts, this is where, that's hard to prove whether or not somebody's making their best effort. But in the event that someone is, that protects them. They're a covered person. They're also, they also have to show that an eviction would likely render the individual homeless. Again, the county doesn't want a bunch of people kicked out. That's not the goal here. Many of the people who are in this situation had nothing to do with the fact that their bar or restaurant closed, or they were put on furlough, or their job was diminished in some way. They didn't do anything for that to happen. Therefore, to go and evict people and make them live on the street is not really what this is in place for. So that's the 4-part test. And if you qualify for that test, this is what it looks like. Let's say I'm the landlord and I want to file that eviction. There's a declaration form that I have to send to the tenant 5 days prior to the notice of termination. So that declaration form looks like this. I can't really, let me see if I can zoom in.
Go ahead, plus it.
Oh, there we go.
Mike, are these slides available to us?
Yeah, I emailed it to Julie, and Julie can email. There's a link to this sort of exists on my server, and so the link that Julie has, she can send it to everybody.
Okay, you can put on the website.
Yeah, and then this is from IDA. This is their declaration form. We just saw the 4-part test. This is exactly what it says: income. So this gets sent to the tenant, and then the tenant says, at least one of the following applies to me. I expect to earn no more than 90. Inability to make payments, best efforts, and then I'm at risk. If the tenant goes and signs this, and they agree that they are indeed in this section, and they sign it, so the signature of the defendant, so then that means that you cannot file that eviction case. You have to wait. You either have to wait till the March 6th moratorium gets extended and that ultimately ends, and there's some guidance from the court, or there's some sort of other breach. We'll talk about that in a second. So this is very important. We want to make sure that we follow that rule, because if you go and file the case, the judges that are on this webinar recently, they were pretty clear. If you go and file this case now, and then you come back to us in 6 months and we find out that you filed a bad case, it's going to look bad. And all of these judges were very clear. Normally, in an eviction case, if we get an order of possession, and this was 2019, and we succeeded, and that tenant has to vacate, normally that order of possession would be stayed for about 30 days. The court system allows for the tenant to go and find a place to live, and then the sheriff comes out after that, and the sheriff might take another 30 to 60 days. Now, that's going to be completely different. That order of possession, 30 days, we will never get 30 days. It's going to be 60 to 90 days. So come May, if that's roughly the time we expect the moratorium to be lifted a little bit more, that tenant, even if you get that order of possession, which means that you won your eviction case, that time frame takes about 6 weeks at the earliest. Judges are already indicating they're going to allow 60 to 90 days in Cook County for those tenants to vacate the property. We're looking at a very long time. And then once that 60 to 90 days comes up, then the sheriff comes out. And by the time the sheriff gets through 40,000 evictions, you're looking at another 3-4 months possibly. So this is Cook County. Lake County, DuPage, they are far more aggressive, and they are a bit more efficient when it comes to eviction cases. And McHenry as well. Those are all counties where they want investor buyers, they want landlords to buy property there and pay property taxes. And therefore, they have a much different interest in making sure that tenants are out of there quickly. So they're going to be on a completely different schedule, and they'll be probably along the same lines as it was before the pandemic. So then there are extreme circumstances sometimes that will not apply to a covered person. And those extreme circumstances are when the tenant has been found to pose a direct threat to the health and safety of other tenants, an immediate severe risk to property, or a violation of any applicable building code, health ordinance, or similar regulation. So this is what opened up in November. So November, we now have this as because a lot of landlords were coming in and saying, my tenant is just turning the faucet on and leaving it. They're not paying rent. They're injuring neighboring, unit tenants. They're causing damage to the property that might affect the rest of the structure. It might leave the stove on for heat, and that's causing problems. So when we see things like that, the courts in November said, all right, fine, we can work with that. We can get those people out. But you cannot go into court and say, yeah, my tenant is being a threat to health and safety. You have to have affidavits, police reports, video, something that shows that this is happening. There's no way that the courts will allow a landlord to come in and individually testify that this person is a threat. So now we have to start building our paper trail. I had a client who put cameras outside of the property and caught his tenants numerous times involved in drug activity. That video successfully allowed the judge to determine that the tenant should be evicted. Now, enforcement of that is still happening, but that was in January. So the more paperwork you have for this, the better. The more likely it is that a judge will believe that this indeed is something that's an extreme circumstance. So let's say we do get that eviction. Let's say that we have an eviction, that maybe not necessarily on a covered person situation, but let's say we have the holdover tenant who just defaulted on the lease and we now want them out and it's not financially related. That enforcement is the same requirement. The sheriff will only come out if you have the extreme circumstances that we talked about. So if we've got just a flat out default of the lease, then you can file the eviction, but you do need to make sure that that tenant's not getting out of there and the sheriff's not showing up unless you have extreme circumstances. Those evictions have been delayed. So you have to wonder, do I file this eviction knowing that I can't get this tenant out through the sheriff's eviction? Or do I figure out some sort of alternative solution? Do I file the eviction just as a threat, knowing that I'm going to probably have to pay them to get out? There have been many situations where I've suggested to clients, perhaps giving $500 or $1,000 or even more than that to get the tenant out, even though they owe you money, is still a better solution than going through any of this. This is the appendix that you have to submit to when you file an eviction. And you, as the landlord, have to sign this. And it says, I hereby state that one or more of the following applies. The defendant poses a direct threat to health and safety. The defendant poses an immediate severe risk to property, and or the property issue is non-residential. Prior to commencing the action, I gave the declaration form, or I didn't get the declaration form back. This is an affidavit that you have to submit to the court, and this has to be, sworn. And this is your shot. And if this doesn't work because there isn't the right information, then not only can you not file that first day, that eviction is going to get pushed back until after those 40,000 get filed, because you've already had a shot and it didn't work out. So I'm a big believer in making sure that we have the right evidence. So you have to make sure that the tenant is doing something wrong and have proof that that's happening. One thing to consider, and when you're having a conversation with the tenant or with the landlord, is that the moratorium does not allow a tenant to skip payments. Nowhere in the moratorium does it say you don't have to pay rent. You have to pay rent. Nowhere in the moratorium does it say when this is all said and done that you are forgiven for the rent that you haven't paid. It's not. You still owe all of that rent. So the current order does not give any sort of significant rent relief. That said, that's what causes enough motivation to reach some sort of buyout or settlement agreement. That's what should create, like, hey, you owe $12,000, you haven't paid in that long. It's a good idea to accept $2,000 to leave, and I'll waive the $12,000. You get out now, otherwise, when it boils over, I'm gonna have to sue you for the full amount. And that's going to be ultimately a judgment that will be severe and will prevent you from buying a home, renting another place, perhaps getting a job. Those are all things that, those are the kinds of conversations you can have when it comes to that. But if that happens, make sure you get a release. You want both parties to release each other. Sometimes I've had situations where landlords have just sort of given cash, and then they come back and they say, oh yeah, the tenant is suing me because I didn't give interest on a security deposit, and now they're gonna sue me, and I gave them money to get out. So we need a release. We need both parties fully extinguished and safe from any issues down the road. So this is what we talked about, lease violations. I represent a seller of property. It's occupied by a tenant. That tenant will not allow showings for health reasons and violations of the lease language. I had this exact scenario last night. So last night, a client who's also a real estate agent, who's a landlord, who's also about to sell a 3-flat in Chicago. And he calls me and he sends me a series of screen captures of text messages to the tenant, where the tenant says, I just don't want to allow people in for showings. So what do we do in that situation? It's coming up quite a bit. So that tenant is not a covered person. So they don't get the protection of saying, there's a moratorium in place, doesn't apply to me, you can't show the place. So you could, for instance, get a judgment against that tenant. You might be able to walk into a court and say, there's a violation of lease terms, this is what the issue is. They can't necessarily claim health reasons, they have to prove that by letting someone to walk in, that they could, for instance, be at some risk. But it's up to the tenant to show that. That's really something that's an issue for trial. More practically though, what happens if we get that order? How are we going to enforce it? How are we going to, because now we still don't have a threat to health and safety. It's not a building code violation. It's not an issue to the structure of the property. Those people aren't going to get evicted. And if your goal was to sell the property, how are you going to get them out or cooperate with a prospective buyer? It's not going to happen. So the best thing you can do, try to negotiate for showings when the tenant's not there. Do virtual showings, masks, gloves. There are methods to get an injunction. This is where you go into court and you basically have a judge make a decision without going to trial on the whole eviction case or the breach case, but just have a judge interpret that provision of the contract. That's a somewhat expensive piece of litigation. It's usually $3,000 to $5,000, and it might not be worth it. So how do you get a tenant to cooperate in that situation? You might not be able to. But these are some of the ways to have that conversation. My client, for instance, put in some threatening language. The parties are not going to cooperate. It's over. It's not going to come together. So my client is sort of stuck now. If you have an opportunity or if you have a client in this kind of situation, it's best to keep the dialogue open and say, hey, I understand, you don't want to have people in there. Maybe we can do it when you're gone. You're going on vacations. Is there a way I can do it on, when you're out of, go to dinner or something like that? As opposed to saying, for instance, the lease says this, we're coming at noon on Saturday, whether you're there. So something to consider there in terms of that dialogue. So let's talk about early termination. We've had a lot of situations like this where I work with a landlord whose tenant wants to get out early because they don't have to live near their job anymore and they can work remotely. What do we do in this kind of a situation where clearly they might owe 6 more months of rent and maybe this isn't an ideal time to go rent to somebody else? I have them locked in. Maybe I squeeze them and, make them pay. The tenant legally is obligated to pay for the rest of the lease term. The only exception to that, of course, is the landlord has to mitigate damages. So the landlord can't just keep it vacant for the next 6 months. The landlord has to continue to try to rent it. And then if they get, for instance, $200 less a month, then that $200 are the damages across the rest of those 6 months. That's contractually, but otherwise the tenant's responsible for the payment. How do we resolve this? From my experience, when a tenant comes to a landlord and says, I have to get out early, they're basically telling you, I'm going to be a problem tenant if you don't agree. They're sort of warning you. They're not going to be cooperative or helpful. They're not going to happily stay in for the next 6 months. They're moving, they're buying another place, or they don't like it here, or whatever. So, does the landlord want to enforce this strictly, or is it better to allow the parties to terminate? I think you've got to let that tenant go. I don't really see a way that it makes sense for you to have angry tenant for the next 6 months. Who knows what's going to happen to the condition of the property? I think it's really safest to go and find out. Make sure. I think it's safest to go and make sure that there's some sort of mutual agreement. At that point, when the tenant is asking you, instead of just leaving and not paying, there's probably room to discuss how much will you charge for early termination. It's not unreasonable for a landlord, for instance, to say, all right, you got 6 more months left, I'll take 2 months, and then you guys can be on your way. That's not an unreasonable request. That's a decent offer from a landlord. Certainly you have those additional 4 months, but if you time it right, maybe it's April, May, maybe that's a good time to rent, if you're a landlord and you're going to get a chance to renew the lease at a time that's favorable to you anyway. Maybe it's not the worst thing to have that tenant out. And if you can get an extra month to cover anything, that's certainly a good way to do it. In my opinion, it's always good to have that kind of a dialogue instead of, if you just respond and say, well, you either have to sublease it or you have to pay the rest of it. It's not going to result in anything that's good to you, particularly when we don't have the court resources to kick anybody out. So if we don't come to an agreement, we can't go to a judge and say, well, they're going to terminate and we want them out and they have to pay the rest of it. One of the things that one of the judges at the Daily Center said was, when things are back on, we're going to be hearing over 100 cases a day. So the eviction judges are just going to hear the same thing over and over again. There's a bit of, they call it sympathy fatigue, where judges start to hear the same thing over and over again, and then they don't necessarily consider it as important at 3 in the afternoon as they did at 9 in the morning. So let's say you're on the court call early in the morning, judges may be sympathetic to a landlord, for instance, that, maybe there's a mortgage and you weren't able to pay that mortgage, you took money out of savings and you paid because the tenant didn't pay. Maybe that's a bad situation in the morning. By the time the afternoon rolls around and they've heard this perhaps, several dozens of times that day, it's not going to matter. And for those judges at the Daily Center, they've made it clear that the tenant is in a weaker financial position than the landlord. And so the way that the landlord tenant ordinance is structured in Cook County and in Chicago, if someone's going to lose money, it's going to be the landlord. They're not going to squeeze tenants. And this is the way the landlord tenant ordinance was written all the way back to 1981. If someone's going to lose out, the court is going to help the tenant first. Good or bad, that's what the ordinance states. So it's something to consider when we look at the new Cook County ordinance. So there's a new Cook County ordinance that took effect in January. This ordinance covers, there was a bit of a gap. So places like Palatine, Schaumburg, they have their own landlord tenant ordinance. Chicago is the one that we're talking about. The way it was structured, it was to prevent slumlording and some of the things that were going on where landlords were turning off utilities if tenants weren't paying and things like that. That's where that law comes from. And that's why it's so tenant friendly. The suburbs didn't have that until January. And in January, it's really confusing because it's the Chicago landlord tenant ordinance. So residential landlord tenant, RLTO is a Chicago one. This one's the RTLO. I don't know why they did that, but it applies to it applies to rental properties in the suburbs, except for owner-occupied units of 6 or less, or a single unit where the only property is the one leased by the owner. This is sometimes, the classic example of somebody buys a condo and they get married and maybe they move into a bigger house, but they can't quite sell that condo. So now they're just going to kind of rent it out. They're not really landlords, but they are technically, but they don't know the rules. So those people are exempt. The Cook County ordinance helps those people out. Chicago, they're not. They're considered, if you own 1 unit or you own 175, you're treated the same way. So this ordinance, though, kind of helped you out for those types of people. But the ordinance is similarly tenant friendly. So, there are lockout prohibitions, so you can't just change the locks. That happens a lot in suburbs where landlords just say, you're not paying your rent, change your locks, and that's it. That's a criminal penalty in Chicago. If you're a landlord, you do that. In the suburbs, it was not until now. There's a cap on late fees of $10 depending on the rent amount, so you can't charge $100. If the rent is late a month, which I've seen sometimes. I've seen $100 late fees.
The late fee is per day or per month?
Per month. Based on, I think it's the cap though is it's $10 up to $1,500. I think there's like a scale, but that's the most common one. There's the landlord has a right to cure any defects. It's 2 business days. Lots of times what you'd see is in Chicago, it's 48 hours. So if there's a plumbing issue or something like that, that's more urgent. If it happens on a Friday, the landlord has to fix it by Sunday, otherwise they're in default. And then the tenant can go fix it and then for whatever cost it is and then deduct that from the rent if it's an urgent issue. The suburban one gives you 2 business days. It's actually kind of nice. It's somewhat helpful so you don't have to run out on Saturday morning or something like that. But move-in fees are pretty heavily scrutinized. You can't really, in Chicago, there's some cases, I was involved in one of them where a move-in fee was considered to be excessive. And so a move-in fee in the city of Chicago, for instance, that's equivalent to the amount of the rent is too high. You can't charge that. In this case, it was about $1,400. You can't charge a $1,400 move-in fee. That's a security deposit, or what used to be a security deposit. In the suburbs, though, is fair game. You can do whatever you want. Until now, you can't. The move-in fee has to be directly related to the cost of that transition. So if there's a buyer transfer fee for the association, or if there's a credit check fee that the tenant's not paying for, or something like that, that's the only thing you can charge on a move-in fee. So that covers kind of the changes when it comes from state, federal. We've got some county, so that kind of covers where we are when it comes to the landlords and tenants. A couple of things I just want to talk about is long-term effects. So rental rates, not only of evictions, vacancies, but also how much rent is. There are some parts of the city, for instance, that experience a decrease in the amount that can be charged for rent. And when it comes to the costs for rent, it seems like the suburbs right now are increasing in terms of the amount that you can charge for rent, and that shifts over time. I've seen it go back and forth, but right now it seems to be a time where suburban homes, particularly single-family homes, can get a lot more for rent than they were, for instance, 2 or 3 years ago. A lot more people need an extra bedroom, bigger backyard, something for remote work, perhaps remote learning. So it's really interesting because it seems like that's going to affect some of the people who might get kicked out in the city of Chicago, but they then instead are going to look for suburban properties. So if you get evicted now, where are those people going? And whether or not those people get accepted for rent in the suburbs, depending on the community. Housing prices, and that's kind of connected to foreclosures as well. So because there's a moratorium on evictions, you can't really foreclose. Foreclosure essentially means that they're not going to be able to, that the bank will take possession of the property, kick them out. You can't do that right now. You can't kick out a tenant. So foreclosures are sort of on hold. You can file a foreclosure. There's nothing in the moratorium in Illinois that says you can't file a foreclosure. And in fact, there's many of them filed right now. But I do know that many banks are not filing foreclosures as aggressively. So I have some short sale files where we're working on right now, where they're working with us, taking a long time, but they're not filing a foreclosure. Whereas if this was 2019, they would have filed a foreclosure by now. And we're a year out, a year and a half out in some cases, and they haven't filed it. So what does that mean for housing prices? There's talk of this kind of wave of foreclosures, but it's not really here yet. And in August of 2020, that was really the end of most mortgage forbearance. So August 15th was kind of the end. And we saw an increase in foreclosures filed after August 15th in the United States. Illinois, just a little bit of an uptick. But will that mean that if there's more inventory, prices go down? I'm certainly not able to answer that. You guys might be able to answer it better than me. But it doesn't seem that way. It seems like there's so many people that need housing that it's not going to result in a decrease in prices. But it's something to consider if, you know, if you have a seller, for instance, that is wondering whether they should sell now, if 10, 20,000 single family homes come on the market in March of next year, you know, maybe that changes pricing a little. And maybe if rates go up, maybe that changes the pricing. So from a seller standpoint, it's something to keep in mind. Rent relief. So we talked about the fact that you have to pay the rent. Other states have come up with other forms of rent relief. So for instance, in New York, there's no rent forgiveness, but every 6 months or so, the state of New York has pooled private money together and some state funding and basically made it a bit of a lottery to get money to pay back rent to your landlord. And so it always goes very quickly, but it's there. And the state of New York has decided that this is one of the ways that they're going to handle this, and they're going to continue doing that. And so in that scenario, the landlord gets paid, the tenant gets to catch up, and the state doesn't necessarily lose a lot of money because it's privately funded for the most part. So other states have done rent forgiveness. Other states, in some capacity, have wiped out rent that's owed to certain landlords. Not all landlords, but to some landlords. I do not expect that to happen in Chicago or in Illinois. There's been no relief for any utilities, property taxes, nothing like that. So there's no expectation that there's going to be rent relief for tenants that adversely affects landlords. If tenants owe money, they owe money. Enforcing that or collecting that money, that's a much trickier situation. And then in terms of government help, you know, so right now we get some relief from the county in terms of property taxes. If you have a landlord that isn't getting rent but owes property taxes, you get 2 extra months to pay your property taxes. So instead of March, we got till May. And they did the same thing in September. Chances are we'll probably see the same thing in with the second installment of Cook County taxes. So we're getting some help there. Also, everybody's taxes went down in Cook County. There was a decrease of assessed value. So it's pretty well expected that the 2020 tax bills will go down roughly around 5% on average.
No way.
You don't think-
I will believe you when I see it.
Well, that's a good point. So assessed value, so everybody's assessed value went down. And all Cook County, everybody's assessed values went down. But you raise a good point. So assessed values are only one of the 3 components to determine a property tax bill. There's equalization factor, and then there's tax rate. Some communities, including Chicago, have already said, we know assessed value went down, but we're gonna work the other numbers, and it won't be a net loss for everybody. And there are certainly some cities in the northwest suburbs that have already said we had, because of remote learning, because of all this stuff, we had to put a lot more money into schools. We had to give every kid a Chromebook. We had to teach our, teachers how to do online learning. We had to go get everybody screened. Everybody had to go get vaccinations. So some northwest suburban communities have already said, well, we're going to have to increase our tax rate severely. So you raise a good point. For the most part, Western Cook County, Southwestern Cook County, North Chicagoland, South Chicagoland, West Chicagoland, and most of north suburbs are experiencing a decrease in taxes for 2020. But we do tax appeals in my office, and I was speaking with somebody at the assessor's office, and she works for the county, she jokingly said, our staff is working at 40% of what they normally are working. And our operations are roughly that too, 40%, which means that me, as a citizen of Chicago and Cook County, I'm getting 60% less social services, but I'm only getting a 5% reduction in taxes. So that means that even if we're getting just that, there's still a gap there. There's still a budget issue that the pandemic has caused. Fewer people eating out, less sales tax, all of those things are, stimulus package, repayment, things like that. those are all terrifying concepts to think about. But when it comes to the taxes, we should be very certain that in 2021, payable in 2022, we will see a rapid increase in taxes. That will be whatever 5% reduction we're getting now will certainly be made up the following year and perhaps for years later. Yeah.
They're talking about even people that have a senior freeze, possibly even seeing a rate increase.
Yeah,
How's that even possible?
I mean, can you imagine being on a fixed income and then finding out that the senior freeze, so in Cook County, there's a senior freeze exemption, which gives you a deduction on the amount that you pay for taxes. And then there's also the senior freeze. So there's the senior exemption and the senior freeze. That's supposed to keep your assessed value roughly at the same spot. They still do adjust occasionally the tax rate on people who have a senior freeze. Not the assessed value, that stays the same. But the tax rate, equalization factor, those can change. But the state doesn't have a choice. And based on the number of people that are leaving the state, most of the Illinois politicians have determined that if we're going to lose people who are paying property taxes, the people who are getting a severe reduction are the people that the state has decided that's okay if they leave. Because they're not even paying full taxes anymore. So if it means that a senior who's paying, half of what he or she should be paying moves out and a young family moves in and now we get more taxes, we're okay with that. That's what the state has decided. I don't want to make it seem like this is not my, I'm not judging that in any way. I'm just saying that's what the state has decided. And the state has also decided, for instance, that if you own a multi-unit building, that maybe you're not getting taxed the right way. And Fritz Katie's office has come up with a formula where they're just going to tax you for property tax purposes based on the rent you get, not necessarily what the home is worth. So there's some good and some bad to all of it, but ultimately there's not enough money in the pot to pay for the state's budget shortages, and there's a bit of magnifying glass on that. So the county itself is working on ways to solve that. But what interesting thing about exemptions and talking about 40%, operating at 40% capacity, if you go to the Cook County Assessor's website today, you'll see it started in February. All of those exemptions, the senior freeze exemption, all of that is automatically getting renewed for 2020. You don't even have to fill the form out. They don't have the resources to go and match all the forms with all the PIN numbers and apply it properly. Normally, that was something that was scrutinized. So the senior freeze, like you're talking about, you had to make $55,000 or less that year, and you had to fill out a form. And it looked like a tax form. You'd have to fill it in, and it kind of, it made you feel like, well, if I lie on this, I'm going to get in trouble. It doesn't matter now. It's getting renewed automatically. Even if that person sold the place, it's getting renewed automatically.
Following year, you're saying that it's going to be.
What's that?
You're saying it's the following year that it's going to be tough.
Yeah, so 2021, so payable in 2022, that's where, we'll probably feel a little bit more of the increase. But, for 2020, if you bought a home from a senior in 2020, and then normally that senior would have to fill out a form to maintain those exemptions for all of 2020, they don't have to do that. So what if they made more than $55,000 that year? They're just automatically getting it. So they don't have the resources to check this. So the county has just decided, forget it, 2020 is just a wash. Everybody gets the same exemption they got for 2019 automatically. That's another good example of, that senior exemption. It's just going to carry. And so it's there without doing anything. So this doesn't work. That's all I got. Yeah. So in terms of advising landlord tenants, I think this is a good opportunity if you have, that kind of a client database where, you have some people that you're prospecting from a tenant standpoint, or you're prospecting from an investor standpoint. These are things that are changing month to month. You can provide that information. You can send out a little notice that says, here's where we are on the moratorium on evictions. Or, maybe there's an investor client of yours that knows that there's a tenant that's not paying. March 6th is the date, today, tomorrow, you can send, just a heads up, the moratorium on evictions expires on March 6th. Keep an eye on the governor's website and see, what they do, but it sounds like it might be lifted in the next few months. It won't be March 6th will certainly be extended. It won't, March 7th, is not the date. Well, March 7th is Sunday, but March 8th, we're not gonna be able to file an eviction, but May, June, that seems like a realistic time. It seems like that's when, at least at the Daily Center, that's when they're preparing for this to be. And it'll be also via Zoom. So now when you talk about efficiency of evictions, if I used to be there in the foreclosure courts where, someone would talk for 15, 20 minutes about how long they lived at the property, how heartbreaking this is. Genuine, horrible stories about losing their home. On Zoom, you don't get any of that. I mean, at Zoom, the way that court takes place now, I'm in a waiting room. So when court starts at 10 o'clock, you're in a waiting room, and then the judge sort of pulls you in, and you only have a couple minutes. You're in and out, and then the judge says you're done, prepare the order, and then things are set up this way right now so that they can get through these cases, good or bad, whether they're going to be successful or not. They're going to be far more efficient than they used to be. So, no waiting around in the courtroom all day to find out, what's going to happen with your case. There's all my contact information. I'm always happy to help. It's always great working with you guys and seeing you guys. We'll have some topics here coming up in the next few months. We'll talk a little bit about 1031 exchanges right now. They're pretty popular. A lot of investor clients are selling, one property, perhaps upgrading to another, or selling one and buying two. Things like that are happening quite a bit, particularly with suburb rental prices. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll also talk about estates and divorce clients, things like that. Just kind of situations where you want to make sure that you're representing your client well, but protecting yourself as well. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.
Really great information.
No problem. We're almost there.
I know.
There.
The fence got approved.
It did get approved? I didn't
Yes.
see that. Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, yesterday.
No, I'm just,
They told me yesterday.
to me, I don't care. That's whether the fence gets approved or not, you guys are closing. You guys are stuck. I don't want them to, I'm glad it got approved, but they were not getting out of that deal for the fence to get approved. They
I
were
would
just,
think that there was something she would mention before, like writing it off.
yeah, exactly.
Something, oh, by the way.
I have to have this fence. Yeah, no, they, yeah, I'm glad, I mean, that buyer though was very strange. Yeah, they just, it's weird. They just had a lot of